The decision to keep the piano had never been a rational one. Margaret had known that from the beginning, from the moment the movers had tilted it sideways through the doorway of her apartment on Carver Street, their faces tight with effort, their language increasingly creative as the instrument refused to cooperate with the geometry of the hallway. She had watched the whole operation from the kitchen doorway, arms folded across her chest, telling herself it was worth it. That had been 3 years ago, before the hours at the hospital were cut, before the car needed the transmission replaced, before the school sent home the letter about the field trip her daughter could not attend unless the balance was settled by Friday. Before all of that, the piano had been a symbol of something she could not easily name. Now it was simply something that occupied the corner of the living room where a couch could have gone, something her daughter occasionally tapped at without pattern or purpose, something her sister referred to as that thing every time she visited. Margaret was 39 years old, and she was tired in a way that sleep did not fix. She worked 2 jobs, the first at a medical records office, where she sat beneath fluorescent lighting and sorted files that no one else wanted to touch, and the second as a weekend cashier at a grocery store, where she wore a red apron and answered questions she had already answered 1,000 times before. She did not complain about this, at least not aloud, because complaining required energy she had allocated elsewhere. She had a daughter, Nadia, who was 11 and had her father's eyes and her grandmother's habit of watching everything without speaking first. Nadia played the piano badly and with great seriousness, pressing one key at a time, as if testing whether each note would hold. The apartment was not small, but it was not generous either. It held everything it needed to hold, and the piano occupied space that created a daily inconvenience. To reach the bookshelf, you angled past it. To open the window fully in summer, you moved around it. Guests, when they came, which was not often, invariably commented on it. They asked whether Margaret played, and she said no, and they asked why she had it, and she smiled in a way that discouraged follow-up. The truth was more complicated than she usually wanted to explain. The piano had belonged to her grandmother. Not her mother's mother, who had lived simply and left behind little, but her father's mother, a woman named Cecilia, who had occupied the same house in the eastern part of the city for over 60 years, and had, by all accounts, never been easy to know. Cecilia had played the piano with a seriousness that bordered on religious observance. Every morning before the household woke, she had sat at the bench and played for 1 hour exactly, not performing, not practicing in any corrective sense, but playing as one might pray, quietly and without expectation of an audience. No one had been allowed to touch the instrument. Not her children, not her grandchildren, not the neighbors who sometimes gathered on the porch in summer evenings and could hear the music drifting through the screen door. When Cecilia died at 84, the question of the piano had become the first argument among the surviving family. Her son, Margaret's Uncle Richard, wanted it sold. Her Aunt Patricia wanted it donated to a church. Margaret's father, who had driven 12 hours to be present for the estate, had said nothing at first. And then, quietly and with a finality that surprised everyone, had said it should go to Margaret. No one had asked why. He had not explained. Margaret, who was 26 at the time, and had only recently moved into her first apartment, had accepted without fully understanding what she was accepting. She had always believed there was a reason her father chose her. She had never discovered what it was. He had died 4 years after Cecilia, suddenly and without leaving behind the kind of organized explanation that might have answered such questions. And so the piano had remained in Margaret's possession, the way some inheritances do, not as a deliberate gift, but as a thing that had simply attached itself to her life and never found a reason to leave. She did not play it. She had taken 3 lessons in her early 30s, sitting beside a patient woman named Ruth, who had eventually suggested, gently, that Margaret's relationship with the instrument might be more sentimental than musical. Ruth had been right. Margaret had stopped the lessons but kept the piano, which had continued to sit in whatever corner of whatever apartment she occupied, its surface occasionally wiped clean, its keys rarely touched by adult hands. The letter from the school arrived on a Thursday. Nadia set it on the kitchen table without comment, which was the way she handled things that made her anxious. Margaret read it after dinner, standing over the sink, and felt the familiar arithmetic begin behind her eyes. The field trip was $212. The deadline was 9 days away. Her next paycheck, accounting for the deduction that had been added after last month's insurance adjustment, would leave approximately $90 once the utility bill was covered. She had $47 in the account she kept for unplanned expenses, a category that had expanded considerably over the past 2 years to include most of her life. She stood at the sink for a while after reading, the letter still in her hand, the water running without purpose. Nadia was in the next room. Margaret could hear the deliberate, exploratory sound of single piano notes, one at a time, each followed by a pause, as if her daughter were documenting something. She called her sister that evening. Denise was 2 years older and had the particular confidence of someone who had made fewer large mistakes, or at least different ones. She picked up on the second ring, which meant she was not yet involved in the evening routine with her own children, and was therefore available to offer advice at full strength. Margaret explained the situation without self-pity, laying out the numbers plainly the way she always did, as though financial difficulty were a mechanical problem rather than an emotional one. Denise listened without interrupting, which was unusual and slightly alarming. "The piano," Denise said when Margaret had finished. "What about it?" "You could get something for it. Grandmother's piano. It's old. Old things are worth money sometimes. At least it wouldn't be taking up space." Margaret looked toward the living room doorway. The piano was visible from where she stood. Nadia had stopped playing and was reading on the floor beside it, her back against the leg of the bench. "I've thought about it," Margaret said, which was not exactly true. She had thought around it, which was different. "You've thought about it for 3 years, Denise said. "Thinking about it is not the same as doing something about it. Donate it. There are places that take them. Churches, schools, community centers. They come and pick it up. You don't have to do anything except let them in the door. I know how donating works. Then do it. That corner could have a real bookshelf. You could breathe in that room." They talked for another 20 minutes about other things. After the call ended, Margaret stood in the kitchen for a while longer, then walked into the living room and sat down on the piano bench. It creaked under her weight in a way it had always creaked, a sound she had stopped noticing years ago. She lifted the fallboard and looked at the keys. They were yellowed at the edges in the way that very old piano keys yellowed, the ivory having absorbed decades of handling. The surface of the lowest keys was smoother than the others, worn down by repetition, by the same passages played over and over by hands she had never known well enough. Her grandmother's hands. She pressed one key softly. The note that came was off. Not dramatically so, Not the wince-inducing flatness of a completely neglected instrument, but enough to notice a small pulling away from where the note should have landed. She pressed another. The same quality of wrongness, subtle but persistent. She moved up the register slowly, pressing key after key, and found that the entire instrument had drifted, as instruments will over time without maintenance, into a pitch that was close to correct, but not quite, like a translation that carries the meaning but loses something essential in the carrying. She replaced the fallboard and sat for a moment. She did not know why it mattered. The piano would be donated or not donated, regardless of whether it was in tune. Whoever received it would presumably have it serviced. There was no logical reason to care about the tuning of something she was preparing to give away. And yet, the off-pitch notes stayed with her after she stood up and went to bed, sitting in her mind, the way sound sometimes did when they implied something she could not name. When she looked it up the next morning before work. Piano tuners in the area, their reviews, their rates. The prices ranged from $90 to $200 depending on the condition of the instrument and the degree of correction required. She closed the browser and opened it again an hour later. She read more carefully this time. Some tuners offered a preliminary assessment for free or for a reduced rate, examining the instrument before committing to a price. She found one with reviews that emphasized thoroughness and honesty. His name was Ellis, and one reviewer noted that he had told her the piano was not worth restoring, which had saved her from spending money on an instrument that was structurally compromised. That quality of honest assessment seemed valuable. She called and left a message. Ellis called back that afternoon, during her break, and she stepped outside into the thin winter air with her coat only half on. He was brief and professional, asking questions about the instrument's age, its manufacturer if she knew it, its condition in broad terms. She told him what she could. He said he could come Saturday, that the assessment would cost $40, which would be applied toward the tuning fee if she chose to proceed, and that he would tell her plainly if the instrument wasn't worth the investment. She said Saturday was fine. She gave him the address and went back inside. She did not tell Denise. She was not sure why, except that Denise's comment about the bookshelf had settled into her mind in a way that felt slightly like a challenge, and she wasn't ready to accept the terms of it. Not yet. One thing at a time. I'd let the tuner come and see the piano first. Make a decision based on what she learned. This had been her father's approach to most things, and it had served her well enough in the areas of her life where she had managed to apply it. The week passed in the way weeks passed when there wasn't much margin in them. She worked, she cooked, she helped Nadia with homework that was increasingly beyond the point where she could help without pretending. She watched Nadia sit at the piano bench on 2 separate evenings and press keys one at a time in her patient, systematic way. And she thought about the off-pitch notes and what they might mean to a child who was listening more carefully than anyone realized. On Friday evening, she cleaned the piano, not perfunctorily, not with the quick wipe she usually gave it, but thoroughly, not with the specific attention of someone who wants something to be seen clearly before it is judged. She used a soft cloth and a small amount of the wood polish she kept beneath the sink for the kitchen cabinets. She worked over the case slowly, following the grain, working into the carved detail around the music desk, cleaning the hinges of the fallboard, wiping along the base molding and the curved legs. The wood, which had looked merely dark and old under normal observation, revealed itself under the polish to be something different. It deepened. It clarified. The surface caught the light from the overhead fixture, and returned it with more warmth than she had expected. She sat back and looked at it. There was something in the proportions of the instrument that she had never quite registered before, and she had always thought of it as simply old, as grandmother's piano, as a large wooden thing that required navigating around. But examined now, after cleaning, it had a different quality. It was a small upright, not quite a console, not quite a studio, something between those categories. Its dimensions slightly unusual, its casework more detailed than the pianos she sometimes saw in catalogs or in the windows of music stores. The carved panel above the keys was not standard, the pattern in it fine enough to suggest intention rather than manufacture. She ran her finger along the edge of the carving. The detail was precise. Someone had paid attention to this instrument. She had never thought to look up the maker. She checked the fallboard now, lifting it and examining the inner edge, then looked at the plate inside the case, and the metal frame visible through the gap where the strings crossed. There was a name. She had to angle the flashlight from her phone to read it clearly. The letters were cast into the metal, slightly obscured by age, but legible. She read them twice to be sure, then photographed them and searched the name on her phone. The results loaded slowly. She sat on the bench and read. The maker was European. German, specifically, from a tradition of instrument building that had peaked in the latter half of the 19th century and early decades of the 20th. The firm had been small, never mass-producing, known within a limited circle of collectors and restorers for the quality of their action and the unusual resonance of their soundboard construction. Margaret did not fully understand all of what she was reading, but she understood enough. This was not a common piano. It had not been made in quantity. Instruments from this maker, the article suggested, were rare in the American market, having arrived primarily through the estates of immigrant families or through a small number of dealers who had recognized their quality in the mid-20th century. She set down her phone and looked at the piano for a moment. She thought about her grandmother, who had played this instrument every morning for over 60 years. She thought about her father, who had not explained why it should go to Margaret. She thought about the carved panel and the cast letters in the plate, and the way the wood had responded to cleaning, deepening and clarifying as though it had been waiting for something to restore it to legibility. Then she replaced the fallboard carefully and went to bed. Ellis arrived at 9 on Saturday morning, carrying a bag over one shoulder and a tuning lever in his hand, already turning it between his fingers as he came up the stairs. He was in his mid-50s, compact and unhurried in his movements, with the manner of someone who had spent many years listening carefully to things that most people did not hear. He shook Margaret's hand, declined coffee, and moved directly to the piano with a focused attention that she respected immediately. He raised the lid and looked at the strings first, without touching them, simply scanning from one end to the other. Then he lowered himself slightly and examined the pin block, the tuning pins, the general state of the interior. He pressed a few keys and listened with his head tilted, eyes not quite closed, to the expression of someone triangulating information from multiple sources simultaneously. He was quiet for what felt like a long time. Margaret stood near the kitchen doorway, not wanting to hover, not wanting to be absent. Nadia had retreated to her room with a book, leaving the two adults to whatever they were doing with the large wooden thing in the corner. "How old is this?" Ellis asked, not turning around. "I'm not sure exactly. It was my grandmother's for most of her life. I think she had it from at least the 1950s, possibly earlier. It's earlier. He straightened and put his hand on the side of the case with something that looked almost like respect. Do you know who made it? I looked it up last night. I found a name on the plate inside. Then you know more than most owners of instruments like this. He turned now and looked at her. This is not a common piano, Ms. Margaret. I want to be clear about that before we talk about tuning. She nodded. I started to understand that last night. It's in better condition than it has any right to be. Something like this age, not properly serviced in probably decades, in a residential setting with humidity fluctuations, should be in significantly worse shape. The soundboard is intact. The strings are original, which is extraordinary. The pin block is solid enough that the tuning will hold, which I did not expect when I walked in. He paused, still looking at her, as if measuring how much to say. Whoever owned this before you took very good care of it. My grandmother, Margaret said. She played it every morning. Ellis nodded slowly, the way people nod when information confirms something they have already sensed rather than surprises them. He turned back to the instrument and opened the top, lifting the lid and propping it on the stick. He leaned over and looked down inside at the strings and the hammers and the general mechanism of the action. Then he stopped. Margaret noticed because the quality of his stillness changed. He had been moving in a professional, continuous way from one area of the instrument to another, a kind of practiced survey. That movement ceased. He leaned further and looked at something she could not see from where she stood. He reached in, but not far, only enough to indicate a point of interest. Then he withdrew his hand and straightened with an expression she did not immediately know how to read. Ms. Margaret, he said. He waited until she had moved closer. Can I ask you to look at something? She came to stand beside him. He indicated a point inside the case, below the strings, between the plate and the inner wall of the cabinet. She looked where he was pointing, but did not immediately see what had caught his attention. He adjusted the angle of the lid prop slightly to allow more light inside, then directed the beam of his phone flashlight downward. She saw it then. At first, she thought it was a defect in the wood, a seam or a join that had separated slightly with age. But looking more carefully, she saw that it was not a defect. It was an edge. The inner cabinet wall, which in a piano of this design should have been a single surface, was not single. Below the level of the plate, behind the lower register of the strings, was a slight discontinuity. A line ran horizontally across the interior, almost perfectly flush with the surrounding wood, almost indistinguishable in color and texture. Almost. Ellis moved the light slightly. The line caught it at a new angle and held it in a way that confirmed what she had seen. There was a join there, deliberate, precise, and very old. Is that? She started. It looks like a compartment, Ellis said quietly. I've seen false backs in older instruments before. Usually they were used for storage of small personal items, sheet music, sometimes valuables. It was not common, but it happened, particularly in high-end instruments from European makers. Sometimes the compartment was built in at the factory as a custom feature. Sometimes it was added later by a skilled craftsman. Margaret was still looking at the line. Her heart had begun to do something that she was not yet acknowledging. How do you open it? Ellis shook his head slightly. I don't know, and I would not attempt to force it. If there is a mechanism, it will be accessible without damage. These things were made to be opened by someone who knew how. She straightened and looked at the exterior of the case, then back at the interior. The piano, which she had lived beside for 3 years without ever truly examining, felt suddenly like something she had never seen before. It was the same wood, the same dimensions, the same carved panel. And yet it was not the same. It had just revealed that it had an interior she knew nothing about. "I have to ask you something," she said. She kept her voice steady, though the steadiness required effort. "Before we continue, the $40. Ellis shook his head gently. "There's no charge for today. This is not a standard assessment." He looked at the piano again. "Whatever is in there, if anything, belongs to you. But I would strongly recommend that before you attempt to access it, you consult someone who understands historic instruments, a conservator, not just a tuner." She thanked him. He left his card, shook her hand again, and showed himself out. She heard his footsteps on the stairs, and then the sound of the street door. Then the apartment was quiet. She stood at the piano for a long time. Nadia appeared in the doorway at some point, I having materialized with the wordless timing she had always possessed. She looked at her mother, then at the piano, then at her mother again. "Is something wrong with it?" Nadia asked. "No," Margaret said. "I think something might be right with it." She called Denise that afternoon, because not calling felt like a form of dishonesty she did not want to practice. She kept the account factual, describing what Ellis had found in the same measured tones she might use to describe any household discovery. Denise listened with unusual care, the quality of her silence shifting part-way through from politely tolerant to something more alert. "A compartment," Denise repeated, when Margaret had finished. "Yes." "Inside the piano." "Inside the case. Below the strings. Ellis says he's seen similar things in old European instruments." There was a pause. "It's probably nothing. A few old letters. Maybe some coins if you're lucky." "Maybe," Margaret said. "But you're not going to donate it now. I was going to have it assessed properly. By a conservator." "Of course you were." Another pause. "You should have called me when that tuner was there." "I didn't want an audience." "I'm your sister. Not an audience." Denise's voice carried the particular quality of someone who was concerned, but did not want to say so directly. "Promise me you'll be careful. You won't try to pry it open yourself." "I'm not going to pry it open myself. I know how you get with things. When you think there's something to understand, you can't leave it alone." "I'll be careful," Margaret said. She did not sleep well that night. She lay in the dark and listened to the apartment, which was quiet in the way that apartments on Carver Street were quiet at midnight. The sound of the street below reduced to occasional passing vehicles and the distant conversation of people leaving the bar on the corner. She thought about her grandmother, who had played the same instrument every morning for decades and had, presumably, known about the compartment, because it was not possible that a woman of Cecilia's attentiveness would not have known. And she thought about her father, who had specifically chosen Margaret to receive the piano, who had not explained his reasoning, who had died before the explanation could be extracted from him. She thought about the field trip letter, still on the kitchen table. $212 by Friday. $47 in the emergency account. She told herself firmly that these two things were not connected, that she should not allow the pressure of immediate need to color her interpretation of what might be an entirely minor discovery. Ellis was right. Old pianos sometimes had hidden storage. They sometimes held old papers, old photographs, objects of sentimental value and limited monetary worth. She should approach the compartment with curiosity and without expectation. She believed this for approximately 4 minutes before the arithmetic began again behind her eyes. In the morning, she researched conservators who specialized in historic instruments. She found several in the metropolitan area, read their credentials and their websites with the same focused attention she had applied the previous week to piano tuners. She was looking for the same quality she had found in Ellis, a willingness to tell the truth plainly, even when the truth was inconvenient. She found a woman named Dr. Harriet Osei, who had spent 20 years working with a major museum before establishing her own practice, and who had written articles about concealed compartments in antique keyboard instruments specifically, 2 of which Margaret read in full before calling. Dr. Osei's office answered, and Margaret explained the situation with the same careful precision she had used with Ellis, providing the maker's name, the approximate age, the visible evidence of the compartment and its dimensions as best she could estimate them. There was a brief silence on the other end of the line. "Can you send photographs?" the assistant asked. Margaret said she could. She spent an hour that afternoon taking careful photographs of the interior of the piano, using her phone's flashlight at different angles to capture the line of the compartment edge as clearly as possible. She photographed the maker's plate, the soundboard, the general condition of the strings and pins. She sent the photographs and waited. Dr. Osei called back herself within 2 hours, which Margaret took as significant. "Ms. Margaret," she said, "I would like to come and see this piano in person as soon as possible." "How soon?" "Tomorrow, if that works for you." It worked for you. That evening, after Nadia had gone to bed, Margaret sat on the piano bench again and placed both hands flat on the closed fallboard. The wood was warm from the heated apartment, and she could feel the slight texture of the grain through her palms. She thought about all the hands that had rested in this position before hers. Her grandmother's hands, morning after morning, not performing but communicating something, though to whom or what was not clear. She thought about the way music moved through wood, how the vibration of a struck string passed through the bridge and into the soundboard and out into the room, how a person sitting at this bench for 60 years would have felt it, not just in the ears, but in the whole body, a constant low-level conversation between the player and the instrument. She thought about what it meant to keep something that close for 60 years and say nothing about it. Not nothing, she corrected herself. Her grandmother had said something by leaving the piano to be passed on, by having played it every day, by keeping it in the condition Ellis had found remarkable. She had communicated something through the instrument itself, through its survival and its condition, and perhaps through whatever was sealed inside its case. The message was simply that it had not yet been translated. She lifted the fallboard slowly and looked at the keys. She pressed one, softly, the same off-pitch note she had heard before. It hung in the quiet apartment, slightly wrong, slightly reaching towards something it could not quite achieve. She pressed another, and another. She sat there for a long time, pressing single keys in no order, listening to the collection of almost right notes accumulate in the room, and thought about her grandmother playing this same instrument in this condition, knowing it was imperfect, choosing to play it anyway, morning after morning, for 60 years. Whatever was sealed inside the case had been placed there by someone who understood something about patience, about the long accumulation of days, about what it meant to carry something carefully over time, without explaining it to anyone. Margaret had inherited not only the piano, but whatever logic had built it, whatever intention had sealed that compartment and left it for the right moment or the right person. She did not know yet which of those she was, but Dr. Osei was coming tomorrow, and the answer was very close now, pressing against the other side of a seam in the wood that had held its silence for longer than Margaret had been alive. She closed the fallboard gently and went to bed. Dr. Harriet Osei arrived at 11 in the morning, 20 minutes ahead of schedule and apparently unapologetic about it. She was a tall woman in her early 60s, wearing dark clothes and carrying a case of tools that looked as though they had been chosen for a specific purpose, rather than assembled out of general preparation. She shook Margaret's hand with a firm grip and moved to the piano immediately, setting her case on the floor beside the bench and opening it with practiced efficiency. She worked in silence at first, not the silence of someone who had nothing to say, but the silence of someone who was listening. She put her hand inside the case the way Ellis had, but went further, reaching down with a confidence that suggested she knew what she was feeling for. She ran her fingers along the bottom edge of the compartment seam, moved them along the interior wall to the left, to the right, pressed in one place and then another. Margaret stood near the kitchen doorway, as she had with Ellis, maintaining the same respectful distance. Dr. Osei made a small sound, not surprise exactly, more the sound of recognition. She adjusted the position of her hand inside the case, then she withdrew it and looked at Margaret. "There is a mechanism," she said, "on the left side of the interior, at the front corner below the plate. It's designed to be released by pressure in a specific sequence, which is consistent with compartments of this type from this period." She straightened. "I want to be certain before I proceed. You are the legal owner of this instrument?" "Yes. It was my grandmother's. I inherited it." "And you consent to my accessing the compartment?" "Yes." Dr. Osei reached into her tool case and withdrew a narrow tool, long and thin with a slightly angled tip. She returned to the interior of the piano and worked with the focused care of someone performing surgery, not hurried, not slow, not requiring an audience. Margaret watched the back of her head and the movement of her shoulder and the stillness of everything else. There was a sound, not loud, a soft mechanical release, a click that had almost no volume but carried its meaning clearly across the quiet room. Dr. Osei straightened and took a slow breath. "It's open," she said. She looked at Margaret, and for the first time since her arrival, something in her professional composure had altered slightly. Not dramatically, just enough to notice. She stepped back from the piano and held out her hand toward it, gesturing for Margaret to come forward. Margaret came. She leaned over the edge of the case and looked down. The inner wall of the cabinet, which had appeared solid the previous day when Ellis had pointed out the seam, had separated. A section of it, approximately the width of two hands, had swung slightly inward on concealed hinges, revealing the dark interior of the space behind it. The space was deeper than the wall's thickness had suggested was possible, a gap of several inches that extended along the bottom of the case beneath the plate. It was too dark to see clearly. Dr. Osei handed her a small flashlight, the compact and powerful kind. Margaret took it and directed its beam into the opening. The compartment was not empty. She saw it, but could not immediately make sense of what she was seeing. The space had been lined with a dark fabric that had faded over time into something close to the color of the wood itself. which was why it had been so difficult to distinguish without light. Against this lining, objects had been placed with care, arranged not haphazardly, but with the deliberate order of someone who intended them to remain intact. There were bundles, multiple bundles, each wrapped separately in a material she could not immediately identify, their edges smooth, their placement careful. Beneath the bundles, just visible at the front edge of the compartment, was what appeared to be a flat envelope of some kind, also wrapped, also preserved. And at the far left, almost at the wall, a small box, its surface dark with age, but its corners still sharp. Margaret held the flashlight steady and looked at everything it revealed. Her hand was not entirely steady, but she held it as steadily as she could. She looked at Dr. Osei. "Doctor." Osei's expression was composed, but her eyes had the quality of someone who had found something she already suspected was significant. She said quietly, "I think we should document everything before anything is moved. Photographs, position, condition. Each item as it sits before it is touched." Margaret said, "Yes. Yes, that's right." She stood upright and exhaled. The sound left her body and disappeared into the apartment. Nadia was at school. The street below was ordinary. In the corner of the living room, beneath 3 years of living beside it without understanding it, her grandmother's piano waited with its interior open, the compartment that had held its secret through decades of mornings and music and silence, finally yielding to the light. Outside, the city continued its own rhythms, entirely unaware. Margaret took the first photograph with her phone, then handed the flashlight to Dr. Osei, who held it steadily while Margaret took several more from different angles. Her hands were calmer now. The arithmetic behind her eyes had gone quiet. In its place was something she had not felt in a very long time, a quality of attention so complete that it pushed everything else to the edges. The field trip letter, the utility bill, the grocery store, and the fluorescent lights, and the quarterly reports, and all the accumulated mathematics of a life lived in tight margins. Just this. Just the open compartment, and the carefully placed bundles, and the flat envelope, and the small dark box, arranged by hands she had never known well enough, preserved by wood and silence, and 60 years of music played to no audience. So she took the last photograph and lowered the phone. "What do we do now?" she asked. Dr. Osei looked at her steadily. "Now," she said, "we find out what your grandmother left you." Dr. Osei worked with the kind of patience that made Margaret feel both reassured and quietly afraid. She did not rush. She did not speculate aloud. She moved through the documentation process with the systematic care of someone who understood that the sequence of events mattered as much as the events themselves, that the story of a discovery was inseparable from the record of how it had been made. She photographed each item from multiple angles before it was touched. She noted the position of each bundle relative to the others, the condition of the lining fabric, the state of the compartment's interior surfaces. She made voice memos into her phone, and speaking in the measured, technical language of her profession, noting dimensions and conditions in terms that Margaret did not always follow, but understood, were precise and purposeful. Margaret watched all of this from the piano bench, where she had seated herself because standing had begun to feel like a performance of composure she could not sustain. She sat with her hands in her lap and observed Dr. Osei work and tried to maintain the same quality of patient attention. It was not easy. Something in her chest had been pulled taut since the moment the compartment opened. a tightness that was not quite anxiety and not quite excitement, but lived in the same region of the body as both. Nadia would be home at 3:15. It was currently 12:40. "I want to remove each item individually," Dr. Osei said, addressing Margaret over her shoulder, while still focused on the interior of the case. "Documenting each one before the next is disturbed. I want to note the wrapping material before anything is unwrapped, and I want you present for every step." She paused. "This matters legally. Whatever is found here is yours, but the manner of its discovery and the sequence of its documentation will matter if questions arise later." "What kind of questions?" Margaret asked. "Provenance questions, authentication questions, questions about whether items were altered or removed before examination." She straightened and turned to face Margaret fully. "I am not suggesting any of that will happen. I am explaining why we do this carefully." "I understand," Margaret said. Dr. Osei nodded once and returned to her work. The first item she removed was the flat envelope at the front of the compartment. She lifted it with both hands, supporting it fully, and carried it to the cleared surface of the kitchen table, where she had set out a clean cloth. She placed it down and photographed it again. The envelope was made of a heavy, waxy material that Margaret did not recognize, sealed along its edges in a manner that had preserved its contents from humidity and age. Its surface was unmarked except for a single word written on the front in handwriting that Margaret recognized immediately because she had seen it every birthday and every Christmas for the first 16 years of her life. The word was her name. Not her full name, just Margaret. Written in her grandmother's hand, to the letters formed with the particular deliberateness that Cecilia had brought to everything she committed to paper. Each character complete and unhurried, the pen having moved with intention rather than speed. Margaret looked at it for a long time. "Are you all right?" Dr. Osei asked. "Yes," Margaret said. She was not entirely sure this was true, but it was close enough. "Do you want to open this one first?" Margaret considered. "No," she said after a moment. "I want to see everything first, before I open anything." Dr. Osei looked at her with a brief expression that contained something like approval. She returned to the piano. The bundles were removed one by one, each carried to the table and placed beside the envelope with the same careful handling. They were wrapped in what turned out to be a dense, waxy cloth, the kind that had historically been used for preservation of objects, requiring protection from moisture without the rigidity of a hard case. The wrapping had been applied with skill, folded at the corners, and sealed at the edges in a way that spoke of someone who had given thought to the long term. These wrappings were not improvised. They were constructed. There were 7 bundles in total, ranging in size from something that fit easily in one palm to a longer, flatter package approximately the size of a hardcover book. Each had been placed in the compartment with its neighbor so that they neither pressed against each other with damaging force nor shifted freely enough to move during the vibrations of decades of playing. Someone had calculated this, or had thought about what 6 decades of piano music would do to objects stored beneath the strings, and had arranged the compartment accordingly. The small box came last. It was wooden, its surface dark with age and handling, its corners reinforced with small metal brackets that had oxidized to a deep brown. It had a latch that was not locked, but was stiff with time, and Dr. Osei did not attempt to open it, only photographed it and placed it at the end of the row with the same careful attention she had given everything else. When everything was out and arranged on the table, Margaret stood and looked at the collection. 7 bundles, 1 sealed envelope with her name on it, 1 wooden box. The kitchen table, which yesterday had held a cereal bowl and the field trip letter, now held whatever her grandmother had placed inside the piano and then played over, morning after morning, for the rest of her life. "I want to understand something before we continue," Margaret said. She was looking at the arrangement on the table, not at Dr. Osei. "When my grandmother played this piano, every morning, she knew this was here. The compartment was sealed with a mechanism that required deliberate engagement," Dr. Osei said. "It did not open accidentally. Your grandmother either placed these items herself or received the piano with them already inside and was aware of their presence." "She played for 60 years. "Yes. Every morning." "That's what you've told me." Margaret was quiet for a moment. She thought about the quality of those mornings, the hour before the household woke, the deliberate privacy of it, the musical equivalent of a closed door. She thought about what it would mean to play an instrument every day, to press your hands against the keys, to feel the vibration of the notes pass through the wood, knowing that beneath all of it, beneath the strings and the plate and the hammers and the action, something was waiting, something with her name on it. "She was talking to it," Margaret said. She had not planned to say this aloud, and was slightly surprised to hear herself say it. Every morning, she was talking to it. Dr. Osei said nothing. She was the kind of person who understood when silence was the correct response. Margaret sat down. "All right," she said after a moment. "Let's start." They began with the bundles, because Dr. Osei suggested starting with the unknown before the known, like with the items that had no personal inscription directing them to a specific receiver, before the letter that had Margaret's name on it and presumably carried explanation. This logic made sense to Margaret, who had always believed in gathering facts before interpretations. The first bundle, the smallest one, was unwrapped with the careful attention Dr. Osei applied to everything. The cloth unfolded in layers, each one intact, and revealed at its center a small leather pouch, its drawstring still tied, the leather darkened and stiff, but not deteriorated. Dr. Osei photographed it, then nodded at Margaret, who understood that the opening of it was hers to do. Margaret loosened the drawstring. It resisted slightly, then gave. She tipped the pouch gently over her palm. Coins fell out. Not many, 8 or 10. Their surfaces dark, but not corroded. Their edges sharp beneath the patina of age. Margaret turned them over with a finger, looking at the faces and the markings. She did not know coins, had never studied them, but she recognized that these were not American currency and were not modern. The inscriptions were in a language she did not read, the images on their faces formal and old. She looked up at Dr. Osei. "I can't identify them with certainty without further examination," Dr. Osei said, and her voice had a careful quality that Margaret was learning to read. "But visually, provisionally, these appear to be gold coins. The size and weight are consistent with European gold coinage from the late 19th or early 20th century. If that identification holds, their numismatic value would be considerably greater than their metal content alone." Margaret looked at the coins in her palm. They were small and heavy and warm from her hand. "How considerably greater?" she asked. "That depends on the specific issue, the condition, and the current market. I have colleagues who specialize in this area. With your permission, I would like to send photographs to one of them this afternoon." "Yes," Margaret said. Of course. She placed the coins carefully back in the pouch and set it down. They moved to the second bundle. This one was larger, the book-sized package, and it was heavier than its size suggested. The unwrapping took longer because the cloth had been applied in more layers, more carefully, the preservation effort greater. When the final layer came away, Margaret saw paper. Not a single sheet, not a notebook, but a collection of documents, their edges aligned and held together with a tie that had once been red and had faded to a pale rust. They were folded within a protective sheet of heavier paper, the whole assembly having survived its decades in the compartment in a condition that was remarkable, slightly yellowed at the edges, slightly softened in texture, but intact, legible. Dr. Osei examined the outer sheet first, angling the documents toward the light without unfolding them. She looked for a long moment, very still. "Ms. Margaret," she said, and there was something new in her voice, a quality that had not been there before. "I need you to look at this." Margaret came closer. Dr. Osei angled the documents further and directed the flashlight along their edge, where the protective sheet had been folded back slightly. In the gap, the edge of the inner documents was just visible, and on that edge, printed in an official-looking font that Margaret did not recognize, but felt she should, were a series of numbers and letters that formed a pattern she could not interpret, and below them, in larger type, the unmistakable watermark impression of an institutional stamp. "These appear to be financial instruments," Dr. Osei said carefully. "Bearer bonds, or documents of that type. I want to be very clear that I am not a financial specialist and cannot authenticate these or assess their current status. But visually, the format, the paper stock, the printing, these are consistent with high-denomination negotiable instruments from the mid-20th century." She set the documents down and looked at Margaret. "These would need to be examined by a specialist, immediately." "What does immediately mean?" "It means today, if possible. Tomorrow at the latest." Dr. Osei's composure had not broken, but it had shifted in the way of very good professional composure shifts when something truly unexpected has arrived. "There are firms that specialize in the authentication and legal processing of instruments like these. I have a contact. His name is Forsyth, and he has handled situations of this nature before." "What kind of situations?" Margaret asked. "Situations where significant financial assets were concealed for decades and then discovered within an estate." Dr. Osei paused. "He will tell you what these are worth, or whether they are worth anything at all. I want to make sure you understand that this is not confirmed. They may be invalid. They may be expired. So they may be entirely what they appear to be. I cannot tell you which. But you think they're real." A pause. "I think they have the appearance of authenticity, which is not the same thing. But yes," they continued. The third bundle contained stamps. Margaret did not understand this at first. The unwrapping revealed a flat case, its surface fabric worn smooth, and when it was opened, it held transparent mounts, the kind stamp collectors used, arranged in rows. Each mount held a stamp or a small block of stamps, their colors still vivid despite the passage of time, their surfaces protected by the mounts and the wrapping and the sealed compartment. There were dozens of them, perhaps more, each arranged with the care of someone who understood what they held. Dr. Osei leaned close and looked at them for a long time without speaking. When she finally spoke, her voice had the quality it had taken on with the financial documents, careful and measured in a way that suggested effort. "I need you to understand that I am not a philatelist," she said. "My expertise is in instrument conservation. But I have encountered stamps in the course of my work with historic collections, and I can tell you that some of what I am seeing in these mounts carries visual characteristics that are associated with highly valuable issues." She straightened. "The colors, the perforations, the apparent age. Some of these may be significant. I would say at minimum several of them warrant immediate specialist attention." "Significant meaning," Margaret started. "Meaning that individual stamps from certain historic issues have sold at auction for hundreds of thousands of dollars," Dr. Osei said. "I'm not telling you that is what these are. I'm telling you that the possibility exists and cannot be dismissed on visual examination." Margaret sat down again, this time on a kitchen chair because the piano bench was too far. They continued. The fourth bundle held jewelry. Not the costume variety, not the sentimental kind that ended up in estate sales at modest prices and was bought by people who appreciated the sentiment more than the object. What the unwrapping revealed, laid out on the cloth as Margaret removed the final layers, was a collection of pieces that spoke in a language she did not technically know, but could hear clearly. The language of deliberate craftsmanship applied to precious materials at a time when such things were made differently than they were made now. A brooch, to its surface set with stones, whose color in the kitchen light was a deep, unambiguous green. A pair of earrings, their construction intricate, each one holding a central stone, surrounded by smaller ones in a setting that had the weight of age and intention. A bracelet of linked elements, its clasp still functional, its surface unmarked by the damage that time usually inflicted on metal worn against skin. A ring, plain on the exterior, with an interior inscription in a script Margaret could not read. She looked at the green stones in the brooch without touching it. "Emeralds," she said. The word came out smaller than she intended. "The color is consistent with emeralds of significant quality," Dr. Osei said. She was photographing rapidly now, having apparently made a decision about the pace at which documentation needed to proceed relative to the pace at which its implications were accumulating. "There are also stones in the earrings that appear to be diamonds. The bracelet setting suggests platinum or white gold." She did not look up from the camera. "A gemologist will need to examine all of these. I know one who can see them today if I call." "Today?" Margaret repeated. "Ms. Margaret." Dr. Osei looked up from the camera and met her eyes directly. "I want to be honest with you, because I believe you deserve honesty, and because I believe anything less would be a disservice at this moment." She set the camera down. "I have worked with historic instruments and their contents for 20 years. I have found things in pianos before, small valuables, documents, correspondence. I have never found anything that warranted calling 4 different specialists before noon." She held Margaret's gaze. "I'm calling 4 different specialists before noon." Margaret looked at the table, the coins in their pouch, the documents with their institutional watermark, the stamp collection and its protective mounts, the jewelry on its unwrapping cloth, 3 more bundles still to open, the wooden box, the envelope with her name on it. She thought about her grandmother playing the piano every morning. She thought about her father, who had driven 12 hours to be at the estate and had quietly and finally said the piano should go to Margaret. Had not explained. Had never explained. She thought about Nadia, who would be home at 3:15. "Make your calls," Margaret said. The remaining 3 bundles took another hour to open, with Dr. Osei pausing between each one to photograph and to make her calls, stepping into the hallway with her phone and speaking in the careful, measured tones of someone who was conveying information they needed the listener to take seriously without causing alarm. Margaret could hear fragments of these conversations through the apartment's thin walls. She did not try to listen more closely. She sat at the kitchen table with the opened items arranged around her and waited. The 5th bundle held more documents, but different in character from the financial instruments. These were older, their edges more worn, their paper a different stock, and they were written in a hand she did not recognize. When she looked at them carefully, she could identify the language as German, though she did not read it. There were dates on them, on the oldest from the 1920s. The documents included what appeared to be receipts or certificates of some kind, with signatures and official markings. Photographs were folded within them, small and faded, their subjects difficult to make out clearly. She did not attempt to interpret them and left them for the specialists Dr. Osei was summoning. The 6th bundle was entirely unexpected. It held a small book, hand-bound in a material that was not quite leather, its pages filled from front to back with the same careful handwriting that had written Margaret's name on the envelope. Her grandmother's hand. She opened it to the first page and saw a date from the early 1950s and a sentence in English that she read slowly. "I am writing this so that it is not lost the way that everything else was nearly lost." She closed the book, or she would read it later, when she could do so with full attention and full composure, neither of which she currently possessed. The 7th bundle, the last one, held something she had not anticipated, and which, in the context of everything else that had been found that morning, was both the most and the least surprising thing in the compartment. It was a single item wrapped with the same care as all the others, but smaller than most, fitting easily in both hands when she lifted it. When the cloth fell away, she held a small painting. Not a reproduction, not a print, but an original, its surface textured with the unmistakable depth of applied pigment, its dimensions perhaps 8 inches by 10. The image it carried a landscape of some kind, muted in color, European in sensibility, the brushwork visible and deliberate. She turned it over. On the back, in a handwriting she did not recognize, was a name she could not read, and a date from the 1890s. She set it down very carefully. Dr. Osei, who had come back into the kitchen during the unwrapping of the 7th bundle, looked at it for a long time. "I'm going to make another call," she said. "Who this time?" "An art specialist. Someone I trust." Dr. Osei picked up her phone. "I want to be very clear that a painting's authenticity and value cannot be assessed visually by a generalist. But I will tell you what I can see, which is that the surface is consistent with oil on panel from the period that date would suggest, and the brushwork is not consistent with a reproduction or a copy. This appears to be an original work from the 19th century. Does that mean it's valuable? It means it requires immediate professional examination." Dr. Osei paused with her phone in her hand. "Everything here requires immediate professional examination, and I want you to be prepared for the possibility that the answers to your questions about value may be larger than you are currently expecting." Margaret looked at her steadily. "What do you think this is worth? All of it, approximately, in your opinion?" Dr. Osei held her gaze for a moment. I think that is a question you should hear from specialists whose professional judgment can be relied upon in ways that mine cannot, with respect to most of what we have found. That's not an answer. A pause. No, Dr. Osei said. It is not. She looked at the table, at the arranged items, so at the coins and the documents and the stamps and the jewelry and the books and the painting. She looked at it all for a moment, with the expression of someone performing a calculation they are not entirely certain they want to complete. My opinion, which is unqualified in most of the areas relevant to what is on this table, is that you should be prepared for this to be a significant discovery. Not moderately significant. Significantly significant. She went into the hallway to make her call. Margaret sat at the kitchen table with everything her grandmother had hidden inside the piano and thought about what significantly significant meant in the context of a life that currently had $47 in its emergency account. The specialists began arriving at 2 in the afternoon, which meant Margaret had 45 minutes before Nadia came home, which she spent in a state of controlled alertness that she would later describe to her sister as the most focused I have ever been about anything. The first to arrive was the numismatist, a man named Dr. Pellegrino, who was younger than his credentials suggested, and who moved to the coins with a directness that communicated both expertise and urgency. He examined each one with a loupe he produced from his breast pocket, turning them in his gloved fingers, reading their surfaces with the attention of someone translating a text in a language they knew very well. He was not silent in the way Dr. Osei was silent. He murmured to himself in a low register, brief fragments of assessment that Margaret caught but could not always interpret. She heard extraordinary condition and full mint luster, remarkable for the period. And I have not seen this issue outside a museum setting. She heard these things and sat very still. When he finished with the coins and looked up, his expression was the particular expression of a person who has found something they did not expect, and whose professional training requires them to be careful about how they communicate the dimensions of that surprise. "Where did these come from?" he asked. "My grandmother," Margaret said. "They were inside the piano." He looked at the coins, then at her. "Your grandmother had exceptional taste and exceptional judgment about what to keep and how to keep it." He set the loupe down. "These are European gold sovereigns and related issues, primarily from the late 19th and early 20th century. Several of the issues represented here are extremely rare in this condition. Extremely rare in any condition." He paused. "The collection as a whole, based on my initial examination and subject to full certification, would have a conservative auction estimate in the range of $1.2 to $1.8 million. The room was very quiet. "For the coins," Margaret said, to be sure she had understood. "For the coins," he confirmed. "Yes." The gemologist arrived while Dr. Pellegrino was still writing his preliminary notes. Her name was Elena Vasquez, and she worked with an efficiency that suggested she had been called away from something important and intended to return to it as soon as her professional judgment had been given. She examined the jewelry piece by piece, using instruments from her own case, her attention absolute. She did not murmur to herself as Dr. Pellegrino had. She was entirely silent, moving through each piece with a systematic thoroughness that the silence made feel almost ceremonial. Nadia arrived home at 3:17. She came through the door with her backpack on and her coat half unzipped, saw the kitchen full of people she had never met, and stopped. She looked at her mother, then at the table, then at the items arranged upon it. She took in the whole scene with the unhurried observation that was characteristic of her, the same quality she brought to the piano bench and to anything she had not yet decided how to interpret. "What's happening?" she asked. "Something very important is being looked at," Margaret said. She crossed the kitchen and put her hands on Nadia's shoulders. "Aunt, can you do your homework in your room for a while?" Nadia looked past her at the table again. Her eyes moved from the jewelry to the stamps, to the small painting that was leaning against the wall where Dr. Osei had placed it. She looked at the painting for a moment with particular attention. "Is that old?" she asked. "We think so," Margaret said. Nadia looked at it for another moment, then looked at her mother with the expression she used when she had understood something and was deciding whether to say so. "Okay," she said, and went to her room. Elena Vasquez completed her examination of the jewelry and asked to photograph each piece against a neutral background, which she had apparently anticipated needing because she produced the background cloth from her own case. She worked through this documentation with the same silent efficiency. When she had finished, she sat down at the table, folded her hands, and looked at Margaret. "The brooch," she said. "The principal stones are natural emeralds, Colombian origin, based on the inclusions visible under magnification. The largest stone is approximately 11 carats. The quality of color and clarity places it in a category that represents less than 1% of all emerald production from that region historically." She paused. "The earrings contain diamonds of exceptional quality. The central stones, each approximately 4 carats, with color and clarity grades that, if confirmed by full GIA certification, would place them among the finest examples currently in the market." She paused again. "The bracelet is platinum and diamonds. The ring is gold with an internal inscription I cannot read, but the stone it carries is a Kashmir sapphire. If the origin is confirmed, which I believe it will be, it is one of perhaps a dozen examples of this size and quality that have appeared at major auction in the past 20 years. Margaret was holding the edge of the table with both hands. She was not aware of this until she noticed her knuckles. "The collection," Elena Vasquez said. "Conservatively, subject to full certification and current market conditions, I would estimate a total value of between $48 and $62 million. The words landed in the kitchen with a weight that was physical. Margaret heard them and understood them and set them to one side for a moment because her mind could not accommodate them alongside everything else that was simultaneously true. The fluorescent lights at work, the grocery store apron, some the $47, the field trip letter. "For the jewelry," she said. "For the jewelry," Elena Vasquez confirmed. "Yes." She left shortly after, exchanging contact information with Dr. Osei and promising a full written assessment within 48 hours. The financial instrument specialist arrived at 4 and left at 5:30. He was a man named Forsyth, as Dr. Osei had said, older and more deliberate in his manner than the others, carrying a briefcase that contained equipment Margaret did not recognize, and carrying also the particular quality of seriousness that belonged to people whose work involved large sums of other people's money. He examined the documents for a long time, using ultraviolet light and a magnifying device that he held over the paper with great care. And he made notes in a small leather notebook that he did not share. When he finally spoke, it was to ask Margaret a series of questions about the provenance of the documents, the history of the piano's ownership, the nationality of her grandmother, the years during which Cecilia had lived in Europe before immigrating. Margaret answered what she could, which was not everything, but was enough to satisfy whatever calculation Forsyth was performing. He told her that the documents appeared to be a collection of bearer bonds issued by two European institutions in the 1930s and 1940s, that they were of a type that had been issued prior to the implementation of modern financial identification requirements, that such instruments had historically been considered equivalent to cash by the bearer, and that their legal status under current international law was complex, but not, in the cases represented here, conclusively invalid. He told her that the total face value of the instruments, if authenticated and legally processed, was in the range of $180 million. He told her that legal processing would take time and would require specialist legal counsel, and that the outcome was not guaranteed, but that the instruments had characteristics consistent with genuine issue, and that he had seen fewer of this quality recovered from private estates, and that she should contact a specific firm of international financial attorneys, whose card he placed on the table. He left. Margaret sat at the table. Dr. Osei, who had stayed through all of it, sat across from her. The kitchen was quiet. From Nadia's room, the faint sound of single piano notes, struck one at a time in the patient, exploratory way, drifted through the wall. "The stamps," Margaret said. "I have a philatelist coming tomorrow morning," Dr. Osei said, "and the painting specialist is available tomorrow afternoon. I did not want to compress today further." She looked at Margaret carefully. "Are you all right?" "I don't know," Margaret said. This was the honest answer. "That's a reasonable response to what has happened today." "The numbers," Margaret said. She was looking at the table, at the remaining items, at the spaces where the examined objects had rested, before being carefully returned to their wrappings and documented in Dr. Osei's records. "Just what has been looked at today, the coins and the jewelry and the financial instruments." "Yes," Dr. Osei said. "That is approximately $240 million. Approximately. Subject to all the qualifications and verifications the specialists mentioned. And the stamps have not been looked at, and the painting has not been looked at. And there is a book my grandmother wrote, and an envelope with my name on it." "That is correct." Margaret was quiet for a moment. "I have $47 in my emergency account," she said. She did not say this for sympathy. She said it because it was part of the context, because it was true, because the arithmetic she had been performing for years suddenly had a different shape, and she was still adjusting to the new geometry. Dr. Osei said nothing for a moment. Then she said, "I would like to make a suggestion. Please, tonight, before you do anything else, before you call anyone, before you read the letter, I would like you to spend an hour not thinking about the numbers. I know that is not easy advice to follow, but the decisions you will be required to make in the coming days and weeks will be more clearly made from a position of rest than from a position of shock." She looked at Margaret steadily. "You have carried this piano for 3 years. Your grandmother carried it for 60. Whatever is in that envelope has waited this long. It can wait until tomorrow." Margaret looked at the envelope, still sitting slightly apart from the other items on the table, her name in Cecilia's careful handwriting facing upward. "What if it explains everything?" she said. "Then it will still explain everything tomorrow," Dr. Osei said. Margaret reached out and touched the edge of the envelope with one finger. The waxy material was smooth and slightly cool. She felt the weight of what was inside it, not the physical weight, which was minimal, but the other kind, the weight that belonged to something a person had prepared carefully over a long time, and left for a specific recipient, and trusted to be found by the right hands. She withdrew her finger. "Tomorrow," she said. She made dinner that evening in the ordinary way. Rice and vegetables, simple and sufficient, the kind of meal that could be assembled in 20 minutes from what was in the refrigerator without requiring decisions she did not have the capacity to make. Nadia set the table without being asked, which was her way of indicating that she understood something had shifted without requiring an explanation she was not yet going to receive. They ate largely in silence, which was comfortable between them. Nadia asked once whether the people who had come were coming back. Margaret said some of them were coming tomorrow. Nadia nodded and ate, and did not ask anything else. After dinner, while Nadia showered, Margaret called Denise. She did not intend to describe the full scope of what had happened. She intended to give a brief account, something to hold the shape of the day, without going into numbers that were not yet confirmed, figures that were still provisional and qualified, and surrounded by the contingencies that the specialists had been careful to maintain. She intended to say that there had been a significant discovery, and that more assessment was happening tomorrow. Instead, she sat at the kitchen table with the phone against her ear, and the table in front of her still covered in its documentation cloth and the items in their careful array. And she told Denise everything from the moment Ellis had found the compartment to the moment Forsyth had left his attorney's card on the table. Denise was quiet for so long that Margaret checked twice to confirm the call had not dropped. "Say the number again," Denise said finally. "The numbers are not confirmed. They're preliminary estimates, subject to full authentication." "Say the number again, Margaret." Margaret looked at the table. 240 million, approximately, not counting the stamps or the painting, not counting whatever is in the letter. The silence on the other end of the phone had a quality that Margaret had never heard from her sister before. She knew, Denise said. Her voice was different now. Slower. Grandmother knew all of this was in there. She had to have known. She played that piano every single morning, for 60 years. I know. And she left it to you. Margaret did not respond to this immediately. She looked at the envelope with her name on it, sitting slightly apart from the rest as she had left it. Dad knew, she said. That's why he gave it to me. He knew something was in there, or he suspected. He didn't want it sold or donated. He wanted me to have it. Another long silence. Why you? Denise said, and her voice had the complicated quality of a person who is asking an honest question and is aware that the honest answer might be painful to hear. I don't know yet, Margaret said. There's a letter. I'm reading it tomorrow. She heard Denise exhale, a long, deliberate breath that contained more than it released. Tell me tomorrow, Denise said. Whatever it says, I will. And Margaret. Yes, the bookshelf can wait. Margaret made a sound that was almost a laugh and found it was closer to something else, something that had been compressed for a long time and was beginning, carefully, to find its way out. Good night, she said. She ended the call and sat for a moment with the phone face down on the table. The apartment was quiet, Nadia having come out of the shower and retreated to her room with the soft, certain movements of a child preparing for sleep. The street outside was its usual 11 o'clock self, reduced and unhurried. Margaret reached out and pulled the envelope toward her. She held it in both hands, feeling its weight, but looking at the letters of her name in her grandmother's handwriting. She thought about the morning Cecilia had written this, had sealed it in its preserving wrapper, had placed it at the front of the compartment where it would be found first, or at least found easily. She tried to imagine the intention behind that placement, the long view that must have accompanied it, the faith that a daughter or granddaughter or someone who deserved to know would one day open what had been sealed. She set it down again, not because she had decided to wait exactly, but because something Dr. Ose had said was true. Whatever was in this envelope had waited through 60 years of morning music and 3 years of living alongside it, in an apartment on Carver Street, and 7 bundles of coins and documents and stamps and jewelry and a painting and all the qualified, contingent, provisional enormity of what this day had revealed. It would wait until she could read it with the full attention it deserved. She carried the envelope to her bedroom and placed it on the nightstand. She changed into the clothes she slept in and got into bed. She turned off the lamp. In the dark, she could hear the city, the way she had always heard it from this room, and it sounded the same as it had yesterday, and the day before, and every day she had lived in this apartment. She was the same person she had been this morning. The math was different, would perhaps be very different once it was confirmed and authenticated and processed through all the systems through which such things moved. But she was the same person. She thought about her grandmother's hands on the piano keys, pressing the same notes every morning, the slightly off-pitch notes of an instrument that had drifted from where it should have been, but which someone had chosen to play anyway. Because the imperfection was not the point. Because what mattered was the practice. The daily commitment to showing up and pressing the keys and listening to what came back. She thought about Nadia, pressing keys one at a time, patient and serious, waiting to understand what she was hearing. She thought about the letter on the nightstand and what it might say, and whether the 60 years of silence that had preceded it would be explained by what it contained, or whether some silences were simply too old and too large for any letter to account for. She slept, eventually, and deeply, the way she had not slept in a very long time. The piano stood in the corner of the living room, with its compartment closed, but no longer sealed, its interior empty for the first time in 6 decades, the space that had held everything now, holding only itself. Outside on Carver Street, a car passed, its headlights moving across the ceiling. Somewhere in the building, water ran through pipes. Nadia breathed in her room, slow and even. The morning was several hours away. It would bring the stamp specialist and the art historian and the envelope and whatever her grandmother had needed her to know. It would bring the beginning of the next part of a story that had been constructed over 60 years, note by note, morning by morning, with patience and intention, and the particular faith of someone who had hidden something where the music was. She woke before the alarm. That had not happened in years. Not since the early days of the second job, when anxiety about oversleeping had pulled her out of rest at 4 and 5 in the morning and left her sitting in the dark kitchen with coffee she did not yet need, rehearsing schedules and contingencies for a day that had not yet begun. She had eventually cured herself of that habit through exhaustion, through the simple arithmetic of a body that could not sustain early waking across 2 jobs and 1 child, and all the other demands of a life organized around insufficient margins. And sleep had become non-negotiable and therefore reliable. But this morning she was awake at 5:40 without effort, the room still dark, the city still in its quieter register outside the window. She lay still for a moment, orienting herself to the particular quality of this morning's early light, the way it defined the shapes of the furniture without illuminating them, the nightstand edge, the lamp, the pale rectangle of the envelope she had placed there before sleeping. She looked at it in the dark for a while. She had thought, when she finally fell asleep the night before, that the morning might reduce the scale of what the previous day had contained, that the specific quality of exhausted wonder that had carried her to bed would look different from the other side of sleep, more manageable, more provisional. It did not look different. Well, the envelope was still there. The compartment in the piano was still open in the other room. The specialist's cards were still on the kitchen table, beside Dr. Osei's careful documentation and the professional estimates that were preliminary and qualified, and conservatively, provisionally, approximately in the range of $240 million before the stamps and the painting had even been examined. She got up. She made coffee in the dark, by touch and habit, and carried it to the kitchen table, where she sat with the envelope in front of her and the steam rising from the cup and the city going about its early business outside. She did not turn on the overhead light. The lamp above the stove was enough. It cast the kitchen in the particular amber quality she associated with early mornings and serious thinking. She had always believed in reading important things in the right conditions, not ceremonially, not with ritual for its own sake, but with sufficient attention and sufficient quiet that the words could be received rather than merely processed. This felt like a letter that deserved that quality of reception. It had waited 60 years. The least she could offer it was 20 minutes of genuine attention. She picked up the envelope and removed the outer preserving wrapper, which she set aside carefully. The envelope beneath was cream-colored, heavy paper stock, sealed with a wax that had hardened to a deep burgundy and pressed with a simple design she could not make out clearly in the lamplight. She tilted it toward the stove light and looked at the seal. The design was a small letter C, impressed into the wax with something that had been carved for this purpose, not improvised. She broke the seal. Inside was a single folded sheet and a smaller envelope, this one unsealed, its flap simply tucked. She set the smaller envelope aside and unfolded the letter. The handwriting was the same careful, deliberate hand she had known from birthday cards and the occasional short note tucked into gifts. Her grandmother had not been a frequent writer of personal letters, or at least had not been one in the years Margaret had known her. But the hand she wrote in had always been like this, each letter formed with complete attention, nothing hurried, nothing casual. It was the handwriting of someone who believed that the way a thing was written communicated as much as what was written. She read, "My dear Margaret, if you are reading this, then the piano found its way to the right hands, which means your father kept his word to me, which I expected, but was not entirely certain of, because he was a man who carried things heavily, and was not always sure he deserved to carry them. I am writing this in the year you were born, which means I do not yet know you, though I have held you once, briefly, at the hospital, and I looked at your hands because I always looked at hands first, and yours were very still and very attentive in the way that people's hands sometimes are when they are listening. I thought then that you would be a person who listened carefully, and I believed that a person who listened carefully would eventually hear what the piano had to say. I need to tell you some things, and I need to tell them plainly, because I am not a person who believed in beautifying the truth beyond what it required. The truth is sufficiently complicated without decoration. I was born in Leipzig in 1920. My family were craftspeople and merchants. My father, a cabinet maker of some reputation. My mother, the daughter of a banker, whose name I will tell you separately, because it matters to the later part of this story. We were not wealthy by the standards of the people who lived above us in that city. But we were not poor, and more importantly, we were people who understood the difference between things that held their value through time and things that only appeared to. My father taught me this distinction through his work, a piece of furniture built with honesty, with wood chosen for its grain and joinery executed without shortcuts, for will outlast everything built for convenience. He said this regularly, and he lived it, and I have never found reason to disagree. The piano was built for my grandmother by a maker in Dresden in 1887. I will not tell you the full story of how it was acquired or what it cost, because those details are in the smaller envelope I have left with this letter, along with documentation that a specialist will be able to interpret. What I will tell you is that the piano was always understood in our family to be an object of specific and significant value, not merely a musical instrument. The maker was exceptional, one of perhaps a dozen working at the highest level in that period, and my grandmother chose him specifically and paid accordingly. The compartment was built into the instrument at the time of its construction, for the maker offered this as a feature for clients who required discreet storage, which in that period, and in the circles in which my grandmother's family moved, was not an uncommon need. The mechanism is on the left side of the interior, accessible to someone who knows to look. My grandmother showed it to me when I was 12 years old. She told me it was a serious responsibility, and that I should not tell anyone about it, and that one day I would understand why. I understood why in 1938. I will not describe in full what happened in those years, because the history is known, and the personal detail is too heavy to carry. Into a letter meant for a granddaughter I have not yet met. What I will tell you is that my family understood in 1937 that we would need to leave. My father and my mother's father, the banker, they spent the better part of that year converting what they could into forms that could be carried or hidden. Not all of it was portable. Much of it was lost. But what they were able to consolidate, through contacts and through the particular knowledge of people who understood that certain objects held their value across borders and across catastrophes, was placed in the compartment of the piano. The piano crossed 2 borders with us. I will not tell you the details of how, because some of those details involved people who helped us and whose families may still be living, and whose actions, though they saved us, were not without risk to themselves in ways that I do not wish to expose even now. What I will tell you is that the piano arrived in this country in 1941 and has not moved since, except between the houses I have lived in. And I have never allowed anyone to move it who did not know exactly what it contained. Your father knew. I told him when he was 18, because I judged him old enough, and because I needed someone in the next generation to know. He kept the secret completely, which is the hardest kind of keeping, and I am grateful to him for it. I asked him if something were to happen to me before I had managed to pass this on properly, to ensure the piano went to whoever among his children he judged would both find the compartment and know what to do once it was found. He chose you. I do not know his reasoning in full, but I believe it had something to do with the way you listened, and the way you kept things, rather than discarding them, and the way you understood that value was not always visible until the right light was applied to it. Well, I'm also choosing you. Not because your brother, or your sister, or your cousins are less deserving, but because inheritance is not distributed equally according to desert. It is given to the person who will use it correctly. I believe you are that person. I am asking you to trust my judgment, and I am asking your family to trust yours. What is in the compartment belongs to you. It was assembled by 3 generations of my family, under circumstances of urgency and loss, and the specific human desperation of people who understood that everything visible could be taken, and that the only safety lay in what could be concealed. The people who built that collection paid for it in ways I will not detail here, because I cannot do so without grief that is not appropriate for a letter. Receive it on their behalf. Use it in a way that would not embarrass them. The small envelope contains documentation that will assist with legal questions of provenance and ownership. A specialist in international private law can advise you on the process of establishing clear title to the financial instruments. This will take time and patience. Do not let impatience move you faster than accuracy. One more thing, and it is perhaps the most important. The piano itself is an instrument of exceptional quality and has been maintained as such. Whatever else you do with the contents of the compartment, I ask you not to sell the piano. I ask you to have it tuned and to find someone to play it who will play it every day. Not to perform, not for an audience, just to play, because it was built to be played, and it has earned the right to continue being what it is. For I have loved you since the afternoon at the hospital, when you were 3 hours old, and lay in my arms with your hands very still. I have loved you across all the years between then and now. Through all the mornings, I played this piano, knowing you would one day read this letter. Every note I played was addressed to you, though I did not know yet who you were. Now I do. You are the one I was playing for. With all the love I have, which is considerable, your grandmother, Cecilia. Margaret set the letter down on the table. The coffee had gone cold beside her. The lamp above the stove continued its amber work. Outside, the city had moved into its early morning phase. A few more vehicles. The sound of a delivery truck navigating the street. A door somewhere in the building opening and closing, with the particular sound of someone beginning their day before the rest of the world had agreed to begin. She sat with the letter in front of her and did not try to organize what she felt into anything that could be summarized. It was too large for summary. It was the size of 60 years of morning music and a family crossing 2 borders with a piano and 3 generations of people who had understood that value was not always visible and who had trusted that the right person would eventually apply the right light. She thought about her grandmother pressing the keys every morning, not performing, not practicing in the corrective sense, playing, addressing the notes to a granddaughter born the same year the letter was written, the same year the trust was established, not the same year Cecilia had looked at a 3-hour-old child's still hands and made a decision about who would carry this forward. She thought about her father, driving 12 hours to stand in an estate and say, quietly and with finality, that the piano should go to Margaret, carrying that secret from 18 years old to the end of his life without ever explaining it, trusting her the same way Cecilia had trusted him. She picked up the smaller envelope and held it for a moment, then set it back down. The documentation it contained was for the specialists and the attorneys. It could wait an hour. She went and stood in the doorway of the living room and looked at the piano. It stood in the corner in the early light, its surface still bearing the warmth of the cleaning she had given it 3 days ago, the wood deep and clarified and more present than she had ever seen it. The fallboard was closed. The compartment in the interior was empty now, everything removed and documented and arranged on the kitchen table. But the piano itself was the same piano that had crossed 2 borders in 1941, the same instrument built in Dresden in 1887 by a maker of exceptional quality, the same object that her great-great-grandmother had commissioned and her grandmother had played every morning for 60 years. It was still slightly out of tune. Ellis had not gotten to tune it before the discovery had redirected everything. The keys still sounded their almost right notes, the pitch that reached towards something it could not quite achieve. She thought about what Cecilia had written, that every note had been addressed to her, and she tried to hear it that way, not as imperfection, but as correspondence, not as a failure of maintenance, but as a message in a language that was not quite any language she knew. She sat down on the bench. She did not play. She simply sat. The bench creaked in the familiar way. The pale early light lay across the keys. She placed her hands flat on the fallboard and felt the wood under her palms and thought about all the other hands that had rested here. Her grandmother's hands. 60 years of mornings. Her great-great-grandmother's hands. In a house in Leipzig in the years before everything changed. Her own hands now, on a morning that had changed everything in a different direction. She heard Nadia's door open. Her daughter appeared in the hallway in her pajamas, or her hair at the specific angle of someone who had slept deeply and well. She looked at her mother on the piano bench with an expression that was not surprised exactly, but was the expression of someone who had expected to find exactly this, and was confirming their expectation. "You didn't open it yet?" Nadia asked. She had known about the letter, having been told the brief version the previous evening over dinner. "I did," Margaret said. "I read it this morning." Nadia came and stood beside the bench. She looked at the piano, then at her mother. "Was it what you thought?" "It was more than I thought," Margaret said. "It was more than I knew how to think." Nadia considered this. She sat down on the bench beside her mother, the way she sometimes did, onto the two of them together on the seat that was wide enough for one adult and one child, if neither required much space. She looked at the keys. "Can I play something?" she asked. "Yes," Margaret said. Nadia pressed a single key. The note rose in the early morning apartment, slightly off pitch, slightly reaching. She pressed another, and another. The same patient, systematic exploration she always brought to the instrument, one note at a time, each followed by a pause, as if she were documenting each sound before moving on to the next. Margaret sat beside her and listened, and thought about her grandmother listening to the same notes from the other side of whatever separated the living from those who had finished living, and about the way love moved through wood the way sound did, as vibration, or as something felt in the whole body, before it was understood in the mind. Dr. Osei arrived at 9 with the philatelist, a woman named Dr. Sarah Kimani, who carried a case that clanked softly with the equipment of her specialty, and who greeted Margaret with a directness that suggested she had been told enough to understand the morning's work was not routine. They set up at the kitchen table, Dr. Kimani producing a magnifying stand, that she positioned with professional efficiency, the stamp collection laid out before her in its protective mounts. Margaret stood near the kitchen doorway with Nadia at her side. She had told Nadia the general shape of what had been found the previous day, the rough dimensions of it, because Nadia was 11 years old and had grown up in a household where honesty was modeled as the default rather than the exception, and Margaret was not going to change that practice because the honesty had become complicated. She had told her, also, that the numbers were not yet confirmed, and that confirmed numbers might be different from preliminary estimates, and that none of it should be discussed outside the apartment until they knew more. Nadia had nodded and said, "I understand, Mom," and had meant it. Dr. Kimani worked for 2 hours. She worked with the absorbed focus of someone for whom the objects in front of her had ceased to be abstractions and had become entirely real in a way that made everything else in the room temporarily less so. She moved through the mounts in the methodical sequence of a person who knew exactly what she was looking for, pulling each one close to the magnifying stand, examining the stamps at multiple angles, checking perforations with a gauge from her case, making notes in a spiral notebook whose pages filled quickly. She did not make sounds the way Dr. Pellegrino had, but she stopped. Several times she stopped with her eye at the magnifying stand and held absolutely still for a moment that stretched long enough to be noticeable. Each time this happened, Margaret felt the tautness in her chest that had been present since the previous afternoon increase very slightly. At 11:15, Dr. Kimani straightened and turned to face Margaret. She was quiet for a moment before speaking, the pause of someone organizing the most accurate and least sensational way to communicate what they had found. "I need to ask you about the provenance of these," she said. "Not to question your ownership, for my own documentation." "They were in the piano," Margaret said. "My grandmother's piano, which I inherited. She brought it from Europe in 1941. She was German. Her family assembled these between approximately 1937 and 1941. Dr. Kimani nodded once, slowly, and the nod contained the particular quality of information settling into a framework that had already partially accommodated it. "That context is consistent with what I'm looking at," she said. "In the years you are describing, certain families with access to philatelic resources and the knowledge to use them converted liquid assets into rare stamps for exactly the reason your grandmother's letter apparently describes. Stamps were portable, relatively concealable, and retained, and often increased their value across borders and across currencies." She looked at the collection, then back at Margaret. "Your grandmother's family knew what they were doing. The selection represented here is not random. It is curated with expertise and an understanding of what would hold value over time." She opened her notebook and reviewed her notes for a moment. "I'm going to walk you through what I have found," she said. And I want to be precise because precision matters here, and because I believe you deserve to understand exactly what you have." She described each significant item individually. The 1847 Mauritius Post Office stamps, 2 of them, in a condition that placed them among the finest known examples in the world. The 1856 British Guiana 1-cent Magenta, the single most famous stamp in philatelic history, of which only one example had been previously known to exist. She said this last item quietly and with a care that seemed designed to allow the information to land without causing structural damage. Margaret heard the words. She understood what they meant in the abstract, because she had done enough reading in the previous week to know that the British Guiana 1-cent Magenta had sold at auction in 2021 for $8.3 million, and that the sudden existence of a second example was not a thing that had a simple market equivalent, because there was no precedent for it. She sat down without meaning to. Dr. Kimani continued. There were also, she said, 3 examples from the 1851 United States Imperforate series in conditions she had not seen outside major institutional collections. There were Hawaiian missionaries, which she described with the contained reverence of someone naming sacred objects. There were early Cape of Good Hope triangulars in blocks that had not been documented in any major catalog she could access from memory. She stopped and looked at her notes. "Ms. Margaret," she said, I have to tell you that I have been a specialist in rare philately for 31 years. I have examined significant private collections on 5 continents. I have participated in authentication for 3 of the 10 most valuable stamp sales in auction history. She set her notebook down. This collection, what is in these mounts on this table, is the most significant undocumented philatelic holding I have encountered in my professional career. The kitchen was very quiet. "What is it worth?" Margaret asked. Dr. Kimani looked at her with the direct, careful gaze of a person who had thought about how to answer this question before being asked it. The British Guiana alone, given its status as a previously unique item and the extraordinary implications of a second example emerging, is not subject to any conventional valuation method. The auction outcome would depend on the market's response to its existence and the legal clarity of its provenance, which the documentation you have described should substantially support. She paused. The rest of the collection, the other items I have described, plus the remaining mounts which I have not yet fully examined, would represent, conservatively, between $60 and $90 million at current market. Not including the British Guiana. Not including the British Guiana, she confirmed. The British Guiana is in a different category. Pending authentication and legal clearance, I would not place a ceiling on it. She left an hour later, having agreed to return with her full written assessment and to connect Margaret with the auction specialists who would need to be involved. Dr. Osei, who had sat through the entire examination without speaking, caught Margaret's eye as Dr. Kimani's footsteps descended the stairwell. "Are you all right?" Dr. Osei asked. Margaret considered the question carefully. "I think I will be," she said. This was a different answer than the previous days, and both of them recognized the difference. The painting specialist arrived at 2 in the afternoon. Her name was Dr. Amara Diallo, and she was from the Provenance Research Department of a major auction house, which Dr. Osei had apparently contacted with some specificity about the nature of the discovery and the urgency of the timeline. She was accompanied by a conservator whose role was to assess the physical condition of the work, and together they established a workflow that transformed the kitchen table once again into something that felt closer to a laboratory than a domestic space. Dr. Diallo examined the painting with equipment Margaret could not name and methods she could not fully follow. But the quality of the examination was legible in the attention it commanded. The work was small, but was treated with the care typically reserved for large and significant objects. The conservator worked alongside her, taking samples, measuring, photographing under multiple light spectrums, the process comprehensive in a way that communicated seriousness about what they suspected they were looking at. At 4:30, Dr. Diallo asked Margaret to sit down. Margaret sat. I need to tell you what I believe we're looking at, Dr. Diallo said. And I need to be clear that full authentication requires laboratory analysis and archival research that will take additional weeks. What I can tell you now is based on visual examination and initial technical analysis, which is substantial but not final. I understand, Margaret said. The painting is oil on panel. The panel substrate is consistent with Northern European practice from the mid to late 17th century. The pigments are consistent with that period. The brushwork is consistent with the Dutch Golden Age tradition at its highest level. She paused. There is a signature. It is partially obscured by age and varnish, but under the light spectrums we have used today, the letters are legible. I am not going to state the name definitively, because authentication at this level requires the full process I described. But I will tell you that the name I am reading, if confirmed, belongs to a painter of the first tier of the Dutch Golden Age, and that the subject matter and style of this work is entirely consistent with their known output. Margaret said nothing. She was looking at the small painting, leaning against the wall where it had been placed for examination. The muted landscape with its deliberate brushwork and its colors that had survived 3.5 centuries and 2 border crossings and 60 years inside a piano compartment. If it is who I believe it is, Dr. Diallo continued, her voice carrying the careful weight of a person who understood the full dimensions of what she was about to say, then this work has been missing from the documented catalog of that artist's output for over a century. It appeared in a private collection record in Leipzig in the 1890s and was noted as unlocated in the definitive catalog raisonné published in 1967. She looked at Margaret directly. Works of this quality and attribution by this artist have sold at major auction for between $80 and $250 million in the past decade. The number landed in the kitchen without ceremony. Nadia, who had been in her room since Dr. Diallo's arrival, appeared in the doorway with the timing she had always possessed. She looked at the painting, then at her mother, then at the painting again. She looked at it for a long time, with the patient, systematic attention she brought to things she was trying to understand. "It's beautiful," she said. "Doctor." And Diallo looked at her with an expression that contained something like gratitude for the simplicity of the observation. "Yes," she said. "It is." By 5 in the evening, the specialists had gone, and the kitchen was quiet, and the documentation on the table had grown into a significant physical presence. Margaret sat at one end of it with Dr. Osei across from her, and the papers between them, and a pad on which Margaret had been writing numbers as they arrived throughout the day. She looked at the pad now. The coins, conservatively, 1.2 to 1.8 million. The financial instruments, 180 million, subject to legal processing. The jewelry, 48 to 62 million. The stamps, 60 to 90 million, not including the British Guiana, for which no sealing had been offered. The painting, 80 to 250 million, pending full authentication. She added the conservative figures. Then the upper figures. She set the pen down and looked at what she had written. "Dr. Osei," she said. "Yes." The conservative total, not counting the British Guiana and using the lowest figure for every category. "Yes." Is approximately $312 million. Dr. Osei looked at the pad. She did not speak for a moment. "That is what the numbers show," she said. "Yes." Margaret looked at the numbers she had written. She looked at them the way you looked at something you were not entirely certain was real, with a slightly distanced focus of someone testing whether the object remained consistent under sustained observation. It remained consistent. "I need an attorney," she said. "I have a recommendation. She specializes in estate law and international asset recovery. I have worked with her before on cases involving recovered cultural property, and she is both excellent and discreet. Can you send me her contact today?" "I will call her myself," Dr. Osei said. "Tonight?" Margaret nodded. She looked at the pad again, then picked up her pen and wrote one more thing at the bottom of the page, separate from the other numbers, circled once. She wrote $212. The field trip. She looked at it for a moment, and then made a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite anything else. A sound that contained too much to be identified by any single name. She called the school the following morning and paid the field trip balance in full. The administrator on the other end was pleasant and efficient, and asked whether Margaret wanted a receipt emailed, and Margaret said yes, please, and thanked her, and sat for a moment after the call ended with her phone in her hand, feeling the specific weight of a small thing resolved, when for so long small things had been the kind of weight that accumulated until it became large. She called Denise at 9. Denise answered on the first ring, which meant she had been waiting. Margaret told her about the letter first. She read the most important passages aloud, her voice steady in most places and not steady in others, and Denise listened without speaking, which was the second time in as many days that her sister had accomplished this. When Margaret finished, the line was quiet for long enough that she might again have worried about the connection. "She was playing for you," Denise said finally. Her voice had a quality it did not often have. "Every morning, she was playing for you." That's what she said, and Dad knew. From when he was 18, a silence. He never said a word. "No." "He drove 12 hours to make sure you got the piano." "Yes." Another silence, longer this time. "I need to ask you something," Denise said, "and I need you to know that I am asking it honestly, and not as a complaint. Ask. The letter says you were chosen, that you were the one she was playing for, and I need to know if I'm allowed to feel something about that, even while I am also genuinely happy for you." Margaret considered this. "Yes," she said. "You're allowed to feel something about it. It would be strange if you didn't. It's not that I wanted it for myself. I want you to know that. I know. It's that I told you to donate the piano," Denise said. "I said, get a bookshelf. I said it was taking up space." Her voice had shifted into the territory of something she was working through in real time. "I stood in your apartment and looked at grandmother's piano and told you it was in the way. And inside it, the whole time, was everything she had ever saved. Everything the family had survived to bring here." A pause. "I feel like an idiot." "You didn't know," Margaret said. "I didn't listen," Denise said. "There is a difference." Margaret thought about this. "She chose someone who listened," she said quietly. "That is what she said. She looked at my hands when I was 3 hours old and thought I would be a person who listened carefully." She paused. "I have not always listened carefully. I have not always paid attention to the right things. I missed years of what that piano was telling me before a $40 tuner's visit finally made me hear it." "But you didn't donate it," Denise said. "No. Despite everything, despite the bills and the space it took up, and me telling you to donate it, you kept it." "I kept it," Margaret said. Denise was quiet for a moment. When she spoke again, her voice had settled into something warmer and more level. She knew, she said. She knew you would keep it. That's why she chose you. The legal process was as complex as Forsyth had warned, and as Dr. Osei's attorney had detailed in the first of what would be several meetings held in an office that had the particular quality of spaces where serious work was done quietly and without spectacle. The attorney's name was Caroline Webb, and she was a woman of measured intelligence and considerable experience, whose first act had been to instruct Margaret not to discuss the discovery with anyone she had not already told, and whose second act had been to begin the international legal process of establishing clear title to the financial instruments and documenting the provenance chain for everything else. Margaret asked, in their second meeting, what the realistic range of outcomes looked like. Caroline Webb opened her folder without rushing and described them plainly, the way Margaret appreciated being spoken to, and without softening and without embellishment. The most favorable outcome, in which all instruments were authenticated, all provenance was accepted, and no competing claims arose from overseas estates, would result in full recovery of everything discovered. The least favorable outcome, in which some instruments were contested or certain provenance chains could not be completed, would still represent a recovery of significant magnitude. The middle outcomes occupied a range that Caroline Webb described with the specific fluency of someone who had spent a career thinking carefully about what significant meant across different scales of human circumstance. Margaret listened to all of it. She asked her questions in the order she had written them down, which was not a dramatic order, but a logical one, because she had learned from her grandmother's letter and from her grandmother's life that patience and sequence were not opposites of urgency, but were its most effective forms. This process took months. Margaret had been prepared for that. What she had not been entirely prepared for was the experience of those months themselves, of continuing to wake every morning and go to the medical records office and wear the grocery store apron on weekends, of the fluorescent lights and the quarterly reports and the careful management of money that had not yet changed hands, because the process of changing hands was still underway. She had been prepared intellectually for the duration, but had not accounted for the specific texture of a life that had changed in its foundations, but not yet in its visible surface. She had paid the field trip. She had caught up the utility bill. She had resolved the car's remaining mechanical complaints with money drawn from a personal loan against anticipated recovery that Caroline Webb had helped her structure. These were small changes, the kind that a person in her circumstances might accomplish through an unexpected bonus or a tax return. The visible surface of her life was recognizably itself. But the foundations had changed, and she knew it. And Nadia knew it in the way Nadia always knew things, not through announcement, but through the quality of attention her mother now brought to the mornings. The way Margaret sometimes sat at the piano bench before work, not playing, just sitting, on with her hands flat on the closed fallboard and her eyes in the middle distance, and an expression that Nadia had learned to recognize as the expression her mother wore when she was doing arithmetic that was not about money. The piano was tuned in April. Ellis came back, having been briefed with careful generality about the discovery and its implications, and spent 3 hours on the instrument with the full respect of someone working on something that deserved full respect. He tuned it to concert pitch, correcting the drift of decades with patient precision. When he finished and played a scale from one end to the other, The notes rose in the apartment with a clarity and a presence that Margaret had never heard from the instrument before. Every note exactly where it was supposed to be. Every pitch resolved, complete, landing in the room with a certainty that made the previous off-pitch version of the piano seem like something seen through water. Nadia was home from school. She came out of her room when she heard the scale and stood in the living room doorway listening. When Ellis played a brief passage to demonstrate the result of his work, she watched the piano with the focused attention she brought to things she found significant. After Ellis left, she went and sat on the bench. She played a single note. It rang out in the room, exactly right, precisely itself, making no apology and no concession. She played another, and another. She moved up the register slowly, pressing each key in turn, her head tilted the way it always was, listening. "It sounds different," she said. "It sounds correct," Margaret said. Nadia played a few more notes. Then, without explanation or transition, she played something that had the shape of a melody rather than an exploration. A phrase of notes in sequence that was not a song Margaret recognized, but was not random either. She played it once, then repeated it with a small variation, then again with another. Her expression was the expression of someone working something out. Margaret stood in the kitchen doorway and watched her daughter play the piano that her grandmother had played every morning for 60 years, and thought about the long line of intention that ran from a house in Leipzig in the years before the world changed through 2 border crossings, and 60 years of addressed music to this apartment on Carver Street, and this 11-year-old girl pressing keys one phrase at a time, working something out, listening to what came back. The financial instruments were authenticated and legally cleared in June. The amount was $203 million, slightly higher than Forsyth's preliminary estimate. The difference accounted for by accumulated value and specific instrument characteristics that the full legal process had clarified. Caroline Webb called Margaret on the morning. The final confirmation was received and delivered the number in the same measured professional tone she used for everything, and then said, "I want to offer my congratulations, which I don't typically do, but this is a remarkable outcome." Margaret thanked her and stood in the kitchen after the call ended, looking at the table where everything had been arranged on the morning of the discovery. The table currently held ordinary things: a coffee cup, Nadia's homework, a grocery list. She looked at these ordinary things and felt the particular combination of enormity and normalcy that had characterized the entire year, the sensation of a life that was the same in its details and entirely different in its gravity. She called Denise. "It's done," she said. Denise said nothing for a moment. Then, "What are you going to do first?" Margaret had thought about this. She had thought about it since the morning she sat at the kitchen table in the dark, with the letter in front of her, and the city beginning outside. She had a list, not written down, but present in her mind, with the clarity of things that had been considered carefully over a long time. First, the school, not just the field trip. Nadia's education, fully funded, with the options that had not previously existed. The school where the music program was real, and the teachers had enough time for each student, and the class sizes allowed for the kind of attention that Nadia's particular intelligence required. Second, her own apartment situation. Not a mansion. Not something that required new versions of herself to inhabit. A home on a scale she could occupy honestly, with a room for the piano that had enough space around it, enough light, enough air. a kitchen table that held only what she wanted it to hold. Third, Denise, because the letter had said inheritance was given to the person who would use it correctly, and using it correctly, in Margaret's interpretation, included remembering that her sister had said you're allowed to feel something about it, and had meant it, and had not asked for anything in return. Fourth, for the causes her grandmother had never been able to support, because she had used everything she had to get the piano across 2 borders and into the right hands, and had spent the rest of her life playing music addressed to a grandchild not yet born. Organizations that worked on behalf of the families who had not made it across those borders. Institutions that preserved the history that the families who survived carried with them. Fifth, Nadia. Not in a way that removed the ordinary texture of a childhood, because that texture was not the enemy, it was the material, but in a way that opened the options that had previously been unavailable due to math. She told Denise some of this, not all of it, because some of it was still forming and still working itself out in the quiet hours between sleeping and waking, when the shape of a new life was easier to imagine than it was to describe aloud. But the essential parts, the list as it existed. Denise listened without interrupting, which was the 3rd time in the course of these events that she had accomplished this, and Margaret found herself thinking that significant discoveries revealed things about the people around them as surely as they revealed things about the discoveries themselves. Denise listened and said, "The piano stays." "The piano absolutely stays." "Good," Denise said. And then, after a pause, "I'm sorry I said to donate it." "You didn't know." "I know, but I'm still sorry." Another pause, lighter in quality. "Although if you had donated it and some church had gotten it and found that compartment, see, I think I would have had to move to another country." Margaret made the sound that was almost a laugh, and this time was completely a laugh, clean and full and surprising in its completeness. She was standing at the kitchen window when she laughed, looking out at the street below, at the particular afternoon quality of light on Carver Street, which was not special light by any external standard, but which she had looked at from this window for 3 years, and had learned in the way you learned a street you walked every day, by accumulation and repetition and the specific intimacy of the ordinary. The light did what it always did, moved across the parked cars and the sidewalk and the corner of the bar and the unremarkable facades of the buildings that made up this block. And it looked the same as it had always looked, and that sameness felt like something today rather than nothing. She thought about the morning she would leave this apartment. She thought about what she would take and what she would leave, about the physical process of moving a life from one container to another. She thought about the piano moving again, as it had moved from Germany to this country, from Cecilia's first American house to her last house on the eastern side of the city, from that house to this apartment, where it had occupied a corner and required navigation, and been called that thing by a sister who had not known what it was. She would hire people who knew how to move pianos. She would stand in the doorway of the new place and watch it come in, as she had stood in the doorway of this apartment 3 years ago, and she would choose the corner where it would live, and she would have it in a room with enough space and enough light. And Nadia would sit on the bench and press the keys one at a time, and work out the phrases that were not yet songs, but were becoming something. She thought about Cecilia at the bench in the early morning, the hour before the household woke, the deliberate privacy of it, the daily practice of something that could not be performed for others, because it was not for others. It was for a granddaughter not yet born, a letter not yet written, a compartment waiting to be found by the right hands at the right time. She thought about what it meant to address every note of 60 years of mornings to a single recipient, the patience of it, the faith of it, the love of it, which was considerable, as the letter had said. She went to the piano and sat down on the bench. She sat on the bench and lifted the fallboard and looked at the keys. They were yellowed at the edges in the way, very old ivory yellowed, but they were in tune now, each one precisely where it was supposed to be. She pressed the lowest key. The note came up full and clean and exactly right. She pressed the next, and the next. She did not know how to play. She had established this years ago in lessons with a patient woman named Ruth, who had told her that her relationship with the instrument might be more sentimental than musical. Ruth had been right. Margaret's relationship with the piano had always been sentimental rather than musical. It had been about keeping rather than playing, about proximity rather than skill. But she pressed the keys, one at a time, without pattern or melody, simply working up from the lowest to the highest, each note sounding in the tuned and clarified instrument with the particular quality of something that had finally been given what it needed to be, what it was supposed to be. She pressed each key and listened, and the notes accumulated in the apartment, in no arrangement that was music, but in an arrangement that was something. Something that had to do with being present in the room with the thing that had been left for you, and accepting it fully, and with the attention it deserved. She heard Nadia's door open behind her. She continued pressing keys. Nadia came and sat beside her on the bench, and for a moment they sat together, in the way they sometimes did, the two of them on the seat that was wide enough for one adult and one child, if neither required much space. Nadia looked at her mother's hands pressing the keys one at a time, with no particular skill and no particular intention, just presence. And she did not comment on the absence of musicality, because she understood, in the way she understood things that she had not been told directly, that this was not about music. She began to press keys herself, alternating with her mother's notes, filling the gaps, adding phrases from the melody she had been working out in the weeks since the piano was tuned. The result was neither composed nor accidental. Mother and daughter pressing keys together in an apartment on Carver Street, on an afternoon that was ordinary in every way, except the weight it carried, the sound of the piano that had crossed two borders and held everything, and now stood tuned and open, and exactly what it was supposed to be. The notes rose in the room and passed through the walls and moved out into the afternoon. They were not addressed to anyone. They were for the room, for the two people in it, for the accumulated mornings and the letter on the nightstand and the grandmother who had played this same instrument every morning for 60 years and trusted that love, patient enough and specific enough, would eventually find its way to the person it had been intended for. In the corner of the living room, on a street in a city that did not know its name, had been written in an old woman's careful handwriting, before either of them was born, the piano sounded its clean and certain notes. Margaret listened. She had always been the kind of person who listened carefully. Someone who had looked at her hands at 3 hours old had known this before she did. She was listening now, to the notes, and to the room, and to the long correspondence that had preceded this afternoon by 60 years, and 2 borders, and 1 sealed compartment, and every morning that had ever been played without an audience. She was listening, and for the first time in a very long time, what came back was enough. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.